Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Jeff Korzenik. Now, Jeff is the Chief Investment Strategist for one of the nation's largest banks, where he is responsible for the investment strategy and allocation of over $40 billion. And on his time off, Jeff likes to make appearances on CNBC, Fox Business News, and Bloomberg TV. And before COVID, he also liked to make rounds speaking all across the countries about economy, markets, and workforce. Now, because he has been locked down, he decided to write a book called Untapped Talent: How Second Chance Hiring Works for your business and community. Jeff, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
So Jeff, one of the things that I saw in your CV or in your story is that you work for 4 companies that are no longer in business. I don't know if that's good on your CV or not.
It wasn't my fault. Starting out on Wall Street, they've had several decades of consolidation, and I learned to be a survivor pretty well, but I'm very happy. I've been with my current employer for over 11 years now and have no plans to leave.
Okay, and the latest one was the Lehman Brothers. That was a big falling in your face. Oh, the company, not you.
Yeah, that's right. So I've been with a lot of legendary firms, but legend doesn't make them survivors. So I'm fortunate to be with a survivor, a firm that's been around over 160 years. So I think I'm in good shape this time.
Okay, great. Let's hope your reputation doesn't follow your present employer. Okay, well, I mean, you've been involved in economics, you study the markets and you study the workforce and workforce movements in the United States. Can you tell us how you got into this field of expertise? Is this something that you were always passionate about, or it's just that life led you to this trajectory?
I serve in many ways as an economist for my employer, and that's been a large part of my history in the industry. I've been mostly involved with the investment markets, but you can't do a good job with the investment markets without understanding economic trends. And I was an economics major, many decades ago in college, but it's easy for economists to get caught up in the minutia, in the big picture. Long-term economic growth is driven by 2 and really only 2 factors, at least in terms of potential growth. How fast are you growing your workforce, which is a people issue, and how fast are you growing the productivity of your workforce, which is also, at least in part, a people issue. And so if you're not focused on what's going on in the labor force, I think you're missing a big picture of what explains the economy and what explains the investment markets. So there's a long-term professional interest in that. A little more recently, and this led me to write the book Untapped Talent, the labor force after 2008, 2009, a lot of economists were observing all the problems in the labor force, and they defined that as labor force participation rates. What percentage of your adults are actually in the labor force? And it was falling. And not a lot of people had spent time on looking at why. So I started getting into the why and came to the conclusion that there were 3 social ills that were more than just social ills. They were big economic problems: long-term unemployment, the opioid epidemic, and the incarceration recidivism cycle. And obviously those are interrelated, but that has really focused my attention on looking at the workforce.
How about population growth? I mean, isn't that a big problem that there is? What is it? Is it negative population growth actually in the U.S.?
Well, it's not because of immigration. Immigration has supported population growth in the U.S., but if you look at what demographers call fertility rates, how many children are women having or expected to have, it is below the replacement rate of the population. So it does say, if we didn't have immigration, if nothing else changes, our population will be shrinking. And that's a real problem for economic growth. The answer becomes, yes, have more children, and that'll, solve your problem 20 years down the road, if that's the societal preference. There's always immigration, but this is an issue across most of the globe, falling fertility rates and birth rates. So the real answer becomes, how can you dive into your current population and making sure that everyone who wants to work has an opportunity to thrive in the labor force?
Right. Okay. So you mentioned labor participation force, but at the same time, there is an increase of productivity in the United States. Doesn't that compensate for the economic growth?
That's a really interesting question, because productivity growth tends to run in cycles, but always on a 10-year basis, doesn't change all that much. And there's limits to how fast you can grow your productivity no matter what you do. So productivity growth kind of comes and goes, and tends to stay in a range, and seems to be something that is hard. You can make it worse. I mean, we had a period in the wake of 08, 09 where we had 3 straight quarters of negative productivity growth. That had never happened before in post-World War II America. But generally speaking, productivity growth, runs 1% to 2%-ish, depending on how you're measuring it. And it is helped by capital investment. It is helped by investing in people, but there are limits to that. It can't solve everything, I guess, is the bottom line.
I guess one of the things that highlight your point is the economy of Japan, where you have negative population growth, you have high productivity, and you have no immigration, and the economy is just disintegrating because you just don't have a labor force to help out the next generation.
Now, Japan's very interesting, and actually it's I hope that will be the subject of my next book. I actually think that Japan is leading many other developed countries in these trends and is coming up with solutions. So they have done a very good job of getting women in the workforce, despite huge cultural barriers. Their female labor force participation rates have not only overtaken Europe, they've overtaken the US, and they're now among the leaders of the developed economies for women in the workforce. They also have been working through technically not immigration, but guest workers. But those guest workers don't seem to be leaving in every case, so it's de facto immigration. So Japan is also investing heavily in robotics. They have found interesting ways to bring older workers back in the workforce, or to allow older workers to stay in the workforce, but on changed terms that are more appealing to that demographic. So Japan is the warning, because they got there first, but Japan also, I think, has some real lessons for the United States and for the rest of the world.
Okay, so you mentioned 3 sources of labor force. You mentioned the incarcerated, or the people who have felony convictions.
Correct.
You also mentioned people who are victims of the opioid crisis, and you mentioned a third group of people that I just forgot.
Sure, long-term unemployment, and that's a really
Long-term.
interesting one. And it's interesting because it occurred in the wake of 2008, 2009. The recovery in jobs was so slow then that a lot of people became what economists call long-term unemployed, which means 27 weeks or more of unemployment, so basically 6 months. And what happens after that 6-month mark is becomes increasingly difficult to get back in the labor force, and you're increasingly likely to drop out. It's particularly interesting because we seem to be making the same mistake, or having the same problem in the wake of the pandemic. We look at what percentage of the workforce is long-term unemployed. It got up in 2010, 11 to about a little over 45% of those unemployed were long-term unemployed. We believe that probably caused over 1 million workers ultimately just dropped out of the workforce. We're getting close to those numbers again in the wake of the pandemic. So we're very concerned about that problem repeating.
Right. Okay. Well, not to play on stereotypes, but you don't look like the kind of person who hang out with criminals. So what is it that led you to write this book about, well, first of all, the topic of the book, which is second chances, and you are referring to the 19 million people in the United States who have felony convictions. So how is it that you got into this topic of?
I actually date it back to when I was a kid. My dad, who passed away in 2003, was the first in his family to go to college. Every family goes back and says someone did the heavy lifting to lift the family out of poverty, and that was my dad. And he enlisted in World War II at age 17. He got the GI Bill as a result of that. The GI Bill paid for 4 years of colleges. He wanted to go to grad school, so he doubled up on classes, and in 4 years got an undergraduate degree and a graduated law school from Harvard. So very, very smart person, but he was raised in pretty much abject poverty, son of immigrants, and he never lost touch with his roots. And he would go on weekends doing what he called errands, but I realized later in life was just an excuse to visit the old neighborhood. And I would, at age 10 or 12, go with him on one of these trips. He introduced me to a friend of his, owned a junk shop, I think, essentially. And after our nice conversation and we walked away, my dad mentioned to me, you know, that man went to prison. And I said, for what? And my dad said he was in prison for murder, a crime of passion. But then my dad said something that has stuck with me always. He said, of that man, he said, he's done his time. And I think that laid the groundwork for me to be able to move past and see past the mistakes people have made in their life and understand that once someone has done their time, they deserve the opportunity to rebuild their life. And then you fast forward many decades, my kids went to Chicago public high schools. Those are very economically diverse. You see how kids from different backgrounds would be less able to survive setbacks in life or have kind of parental protections that we provide for our children. And the real clincher was in the middle of this labor force problem. I went to a restaurant in Charlotte, North Carolina called the King's Kitchen, and they specialize in helping people rebuild their lives. People with criminal convictions, people with who are recovering addicts, people who are even homeless, and they allow them to rebuild their lives and get training and build careers in the restaurant industry. And that was such an exciting concept to me, and my first real interaction with people with backgrounds like this. And it led me to start talking about it. And one of our bankers, I work for a large bank, introduced me to the CEO of a company called Nehemiah Manufacturing. And it's one of the companies I write about in the book. Dan Meyer, the founder and CEO, started this company a couple years back. 130 of his 180 employees are second chance hires. And Nehemiah Manufacturing is the subject of Harvard Business School's first case study of a second chance employer. It was an incredibly inspirational meeting. And it piqued my curiosity. I started tracking down companies that were doing this. And to my surprise, I found that although they didn't know each other, different industries, different geographies, they all had what to me looked like the same model of success. So I started sharing that model of success, and that got me involved. And it is true that earlier in my life, I did not, as you said, hang out with people with criminal records. But now I count among my very good friends, people who've have different backgrounds than myself, and they have their friendship has enriched my life very much.
Okay, well, in your case, you mentioned that it makes business sense to have people who have done their time. But also, I think the primary motivation of many of these businesses, more than business sense, is a humanitarian. They want to do good and heal the community around them. So what's your perspective? Is it business end, or is it a humanitarian effort to heal a society?
I think it is, in many cases, particularly among these pioneers, there was a sense that they wanted to be part of solving a problem, but they couldn't do it unless it made business sense. Businesses will look at a humanitarian problem and they'll say, you know, if I believe in trying to fix this, I'll write a check. The real question is, hiring someone has to be profitable for the business. That's their core livelihood. You don't dilute that or get distracted from that. If you believe in an issue, you typically wouldn't hire someone from that background unless it could be justified on a business basis. Otherwise, you just write a check. It's the same reason, you and I might look at the terrible problem of homelessness, yet not open up our second bedroom to someone who's living on the streets. We're willing to write a check, but we have our own life and have to move forward. But I will say that there are also many employers who really came to this purely as a business proposition. They couldn't find labor anywhere else. In the book, the case study, there's a chapter devoted to a case study of a single employer, JBM Packaging, and the CEO of that came to it simply as he ran out of labor. He tried everything else, and he thought he'd try this as well. Now, I will say he had a cultural openness to this. I heard about second chance employment at his church. Many of the employers who have undertaken second chance employment and really given it a try come from Christian traditions. And I think, the concepts of original sin, forgiveness, and redemption prepare you well for at least being willing to give it a try.
Okay, so there is a business reason to hire people with criminal cases, and
Absolutely.
There's a humanitarian reason. What are the main obstacles? There's I guess the big stigma that if this person did something wrong, they're gonna be doing something wrong for the rest of their life. Is that
that's part of it? There's certainly a tremendous stigma against someone with a criminal record, and it's important to take those objections very seriously. The objections seem to boil down to three main points. The first objection is one of safety and liability. Is something going to happen? And is this something that might cause you not just a loss in your business, but actually a negligent hiring liability is a big fear. You can have more liability as an employer for hiring someone with a criminal record if something goes wrong. And so that's one sort of obstacle. The other obstacle is many people assume that people with criminal records simply can't be good employees. And they have this, again, it's part of a stigma. And then the final objection is fear over how the public will perceive it. Will the public be afraid to come to my place of business, or will there be some other damage to my reputation related to hiring people with criminal records? So those are big objections. In the book, I take them very seriously, and you can't get around all of them. There's no no doubt that these are real issues or real concerns, but I try to put them in perspective, try to show ways that businesses can minimize the risks and maximize the potential return of using this population as a talent pool.
And which are some businesses that are showing some leadership? I mean, you mentioned a few small businesses already, but any of the Fortune 500s are going out there and saying we are opening our doors to people who have criminal records?
It's interesting because there are some out there, but many of them are not to the point they want to advertise it.
Right.
And I will say that there are a couple places that have been known to offer second chances. That they are really all around us. I've seen people at major airline companies, major food chains, major logistics. The question is whether they advertise it or not, or whether they do it in the really holistic way of supporting employees that gives everyone truly a chance to thrive, or whether they're just kind of picking among people who are already sort of stabilized. There are a couple I know of, but their programs have been told to me in confidence, so I don't like to advertise that. I will say that there's some companies like Kroger Stores has started the New Beginnings program. This is the third or fourth largest employer in the United States. They are embarking on this. It's in its infancy. They started with a trial. You can look up New Beginnings on their website. So absolute, my hat's off to their leadership. You have companies like J.P. Morgan has both gotten involved in the policy aspect of this, as well as in the annual shareholder letter. There was Jamie Dimon, their CEO, spent several paragraphs on second chances and stated that the bank had hired about 2,000 people in need of a second chance last year. So great leadership here and there. I believe there's more coming. Again, some of this is not yet public information, but I think in the next couple of months, you'll see some major U.S. corporations become very public about this.
Well, I guess with first of all, with low unemployment, which I mean, except for COVID, but generally there has been low unemployment in the United States for a couple of years, and with 19 million people with felony convictions, there's no other choice. You have to look into this labor force and see what's the potential here.
Yeah, I think that was certainly true, but even before then, and there are a couple names that I neglected to mention that I should mention. Richard Branson, Virgin Airlines, has been a leader in this. Koch Industries has been a leader in this, even when there was an abundant amount of available labor. So there's some tremendous leadership there. But many companies came to it because they started to run out of labor. And what's interesting to me is, and unexpected, is that during the pandemic, and now in its aftermath, the unemployment rate is still pretty elevated, but you still have a strong movement towards this. I think one of the offshoots of the pandemic period, and particularly the social recognition, societal recognition that we have problems with inequality and our justice system, has gotten larger companies, even if they have abundant sources of labor, a little bit more focused on this and more willing to become involved. And that's going to be a very, very healthy development for the American economy as well as for our society.
Well, when you write this book, you have what I like to say, your business glasses on. But what about government? Is government itself contributing to provide jobs for people with criminal records?
It's interesting. Government has done some hiring, but there are, in my opinion, there's an opportunity for more states and municipalities and agencies to have active programs, because it's not just willing to consider someone, it's providing the kind of support network that is needed for people from these backgrounds to thrive. In Chicago, the Chicago Transit Authority has one of the largest, perhaps the largest second chance program in the country. It's a 1-year-long internship. Out of that internship, that maybe 1,000 people have been through it, and several hundred are now employees of the agency. They do it the right way. They partner with nonprofits that help support people so that they can thrive, and they give people the mentoring that often people who have criminal backgrounds did not receive earlier in life and need in order to be successful employees. That's one. The city of Louisville, Kentucky has an intern program. There are a couple others scattered around the country, but frankly, I think government can and should do a lot more.
Right. Is there a limit to how much you should open your door to people with criminal record? For example, if I am the operator of a kindergarten, I would be hesitant to hire someone with some kind of sex conviction.
Absolutely. And each business has to examine this. And one of the things that's important to understand is that public safety should never be compromised. This is not about risking public safety. It's about identifying who is low risk, because any employee is a risk, and who has earned that and is ready to rebuild their life. But absolutely, other employees should be protected. Innocents, like children, should be protected. But employers have to do have the opportunity to set their own parameters. And what I would argue is that they should set those at a reasonable level and not exclude everyone. When people say, well, there are the problems like the ones you absolutely raised, I always say there are 19 million people with felony convictions. Are you saying not one of those 19 million can be a good employee? And of course, the answer everyone recognizes, well, no, there are some who can be a good employee and can be a great employee. So my whole model and approach is not going to solve it for all 19 million, but just identify those who are ready and who can become or can be made ready and who can become great employees. And so that's but you're absolutely right. It's very important to place boundaries on what you will consider. To give some perspective, though, it's important to recognize that the crime doesn't always tell you something about the person. And the plurality of people, not quite 50%, but close to 50%, more than any other category of crime, the plurality of people who are in prisons in the United States are there for crimes of violence. But that doesn't mean that the person who was convicted of a crime of violence is a violent person today. And sometimes doesn't even tell you whether that person was violent when the crime was committed. A lot of these crimes are related to the drug trade. A lot of these are committed, a huge amount are committed by young men. Young men, we know neurologically, don't always have great judgment, tend to, in some cases, have issues with emotional management. And it can be just a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being stupid, in ways that we who are of a different age can kind of look back and recognize that many of us were stupid in our own past, and that you can't judge the person today by the crime of 5 or 10 years ago.
Right, and there is a huge percentage of inmates who are there for non-violent crimes, just simple possession of drugs, who are serving long sentences.
That's actually, that's become more of a myth. There are some exceptions to that. No, most people, it's very rare for someone to be in prison today. It's not zero, but it's a very small minority of people who are there truly for possession. If it was possession, it's usually possession with intent to sell and large volumes, or repeat offenders. But that is one of the things that I think is important in addressing the business community is let's look at the numbers. Let's not sugarcoat this. Most people are there because they are serving prison terms because they committed fairly serious crimes. Property, violence are the most common. But it's also important to note that the majority of people convicted of felonies were convicted of crimes of such minor threat to public safety, they were never required to serve a prison term. So to your point, yes, someone with possession might have a felony, but they probably didn't serve a prison term. But that felony conviction is still that enormous barrier to getting a job and building a career. The core message I have to employers is don't immediately discard a resume or an application because there's a felony conviction. And if you're going to examine that on a truly fair basis.
Well, are there companies who are just... Oh, okay. So there was this case a few weeks ago. I mean, not to get into politics, but the White House fired some kids because of simple drug use that they confess that they have done in the past. I mean, are there companies or segments of governments that is still so narrow-minded that because you smoke a joint, I don't know, a few years before, now your opportunities of employment in the White House or other government branches are just closed?
I think that's the exception rather than the rule these days. There's simply too much of a talent shortage for someone to overlook that. One of the things that certain employers have the luxury of being able to dictate terms, right? Because Yeah, everyone wants to work in the White House, so you can dictate whatever terms you want. There aren't many employers that have that ability. Maybe a couple of the top tech companies can have that attraction, but the bulk of employers have to realize that they can't unnecessarily exclude talent because there is not an infinite supply of the talent they need.
Right. Okay. Well, this is an amazing conversation. I hope millions of employers get your book, read it, and just realize that there is an untapped amount of talent out there that are desperate for a second chance opportunity, and it's within their power to give that second chance and to improve society overall. I wonder if you could just reach back behind you, take one of those books and show it to the camera and tell us one more time the title of the book and where people can follow you.
Sure. This is Untapped Talent, How Second Chance Hiring Works for Your Business and the Community. It's available through booksellers everywhere, Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles, even independent bookstores. People can follow me on my website, jeffkorzenik.com, JEFFKORZENIK.com. There are links on there in the book section to booksellers. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. I'm the only Jeff Korzenik on the planet, so I'm pretty easy to find. And I more recently opened a Twitter account as well, but LinkedIn is where I put most of my information, and information on the book itself is through all the traditional booksellers as well as jeffkorzenik.com.
Jeff, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Great to talk to you.